This is the first module of what will end up being 11 modules on various topics for the Professional Surveyor Exam Review, and this is being sponsored by the Indiana Society of Professional Land Surveyors. These modules have been taught live for many years at a couple different times during the year in order to provide potential examinees some study material as they get ready to sit for this portion of the professional surveyor examination process. This particular section, which is being called the introduction session, will talk a little bit about the generalities of the professional surveyor's exam, familiarize you with some of the intricacies, if you will, of the NCEES webpage so that you can be prepared for what to expect, as well as give you some pointers on what to expect for the Indiana state-specific portion of the PS exam. Since you'll be hearing my voice quite a bit, as I will be doing most, if not all, of the presenting during these modules, I figure I should introduce myself to you so you have a little bit of knowledge about who I am and what my background's about. I am a professor emeritus of the Civil Engineering Technology program at Purdue University Calumet, which is now called Purdue University Northwest, and that's in Hammond, Indiana. I worked there for 35 years, from 1983 to 2018, as a professor and department head. I am a licensed professional surveyor. I'm licensed in both Indiana and Illinois, and I maintain those licenses. For most of the time that I taught at Purdue, I consulted on my own, and the last several years of that time that ended in 2018, I consulted as Gregory Land Surveying, working out of my home, did numerous surveying projects focusing primarily on boundary surveys, ALTA surveys, and small subdivisions. I regularly present seminars for numerous state societies on various land surveying topics, and I hope to continue doing that well into the future. I still work somewhat as a professional surveyor. I'm currently consulting through a surveying office in Hobart, Indiana that's called Kroll Abbenmarsh. And I've been active in my professional societies. I've been a member for many years of the Indiana Society of Professional Land Surveyors. I note here that I served on that board from 1999 to 2005, and I served as president of the board in 2001. I've been a longtime member of NSPS, and I'm currently the NSPS director for Indiana, as well as the NSPS TrigStar coordinator for Indiana. I've served on NSPS's TrigStar committee for probably about 20 years now, and I have maintained membership in the Illinois Professional Land Surveyors Association for as long as I've had my license there. And over the last year or so, my wife and I have taken on a new role in life here. We were asked to move to the Grove City, Ohio area, and we did in July of 2019, and we are both currently working as co-pastors of Centerpoint Church there. The order of the modules we'll go over here with the titles of those modules is shown on this slide here. Again, we're starting with the introduction. Our next module, Module 2, will be on Indiana history related, of course, to surveying. Module 3 will be relative to the General Land Office, United States Public Land System, and Tiffin's instructions. This will be focusing on the public land system, particularly as it pertains to what took place in Indiana. The fourth module will be on Indiana law. The fifth will be on legal descriptions. Module 6 will be on unwritten rights. Module 7 will be on sequential and simultaneous conveyances. Module 8 will be on the portion of the administrative code in Indiana relative to surveying, Title 865 IAC 1-12. We particularly refer to this as Rule 12, and that's the minimum standards of practice for boundary surveys in Indiana. Module 9 is also from the administrative code. That would be Rule 10, and that covers ethics or professional conduct. Module 10 will be on the minimum standard detail requirements of the ALTA/NSPS land title surveys, the most current rule. And Module 11 is on site planning and design. The bulk of what I'm going to go over here for what's going to remain in this introduction session is going to be information that you should know how to get at and look for on the NCAAS webpage, as well as some information about what you should expect to see on the Indiana State specific portion of the test, and study areas and study sources that you should look for in order to prepare for that test. So let's start with the NCAAS information. And I hope you've been on the web page. I'm sure you probably have been at some point or another, but they do make changes on some of these things just about every year, and so you need to be current if you're going to be getting into a testing situation with them. And of course, NCAAS stands for the National Council of Examiners for Engineering and Surveying. The website is pretty easy to navigate, and you should easily be able to know where to go for engineering exams and then where to go for surveying exams. And so under surveying, of course, they have two different exams that they administer. They administer the FS exam, which is the Fundamentals of Surveying exam, and then they have what we're looking at here, which would be the Practice of Surveying, or PS exam. And on their webpage, they say that the PS exam tests your ability to practice the surveying profession competently. It is designed for surveyors who have gained at least 4 years' experience, and it is typically the last step in the process of becoming a licensed professional surveyor. Now, I figure we have two different types of individuals that are getting ready to take this test in Indiana. Some of you may have passed the FS exam, the fundamentals test, maybe a few years ago and gotten your experience under you. The fundamentals is what we used to call the surveyor in training, or SIT exam, and then you'd have to work generally for so many years before you can sit for the LS exam, as it used to be called, or the PS exam as we call it now. And so the way that this test is described, this PS exam is described, is that you've gained at least 4 years of experience, and those years of experience, and the 4 years here is looked upon as a norm that most would have from an experience standpoint after they received their fundamentals test. That's going to vary from state to state and how the process goes, and that's also going to vary from individual to individual. And the second kind of person we're going to have here is somebody that is already licensed as a surveyor in another state or maybe more, and you're trying to get Indiana's license now, and so you may not be doing much with NCAAS. You only maybe need to come in here and take the Indiana state portion of the test. But anyway, the PS exam, as you would take it through NCAAS, is a computer-based test exam, and it contains 100 questions. The total appointment time is 7 hours. And there's 2 minutes for a non-disclosure agreement, 8 minutes for a tutorial, and 6 hours for the actual exam. There are 2 sections of the exam that are approximately 50 questions each, with an optional 50-minute scheduled break offered at the end of the first section. And the PS exam uses the United States customary system of measurements. Relative to reference materials and exam preparation, the NCAAS PS Reference Handbook is the only reference material that can be used during the exam. You will be provided with an electronic reference handbook during the exam. Register or log into MyNCAAS to download your free copy of the PS Reference Handbook. And in addition to that handbook, NCEES also offers computer-based practice exams. These practice exams contain questions that have been used on past exams and questions written just for study materials to give you some extra practice. If you need to take the entire PS exam, and so you're going to be getting into what NCAAS is going to have on their exam, I really strongly would suggest you spend some time looking through their general exam specifications if you haven't done that yet. They had already mentioned here that they have 100 questions, and here they give you ranges of topics based in 5 different categories, and how many questions, approximate number of questions, would come from each of these areas. And they got some pretty wide ranges here. They got 5 different areas. They got legal principles, they got professional survey practices, they got standards and specifications, business and professional practices, and then areas of practice. And some of this is going to overlap some with Indiana also, but the legal principles portion has principles of evidence, common law boundary principles, sequential and simultaneous conveyances, legal descriptions, and evidence for the perpetuation of the United States Public Land Survey System. The second area gets into professional surveying practices. They have public-private record sources, field procedures, GPS and GNSS, surveying principles and computations, monumentation standards, land development topics, plats and reports, and GIS. And then the third area is standards and specifications. It's got the fewest numbers of categories, and it's got also the fewest numbers of questions. BLM is Bureau of Land Management, ALTA NSPS Land Survey Standards, minimum standards, and FEMA requirements. And then the fourth area is business and professional practices, general business, risk management, professional conduct, and communication. And then the last area, the fifth area, has got all kinds of areas of practice there. You've got ALTA NSPS survey standards, you got control and geodetic networks, boundary surveys, route surveys, topographic surveys, surveys for new parcels, lots, and units, as-built or record document surveys, and consultation services. So a lot of areas here, and this might be worth your while as you're going through these to look at some of the sample tests to get an idea for some of the questions that were asked. But as you can see, we're not going over every single topic that's on this list here or within these categories, and some of these are local in area, and when you're taking a national test, there are some questions that need to be handled by the individual states from different areas because of the difference in surveying principles there. But we cover an awful lot that you're going to have here in these 11 modules we have here, but certainly not anywhere close to all of it. Here we're talking a little bit about the scoring and reporting through NCEES, and also the latest tier of exams that they've given the pass rates. As far as scoring and reporting, the exam results are typically released to the licensing boards 8 to 10 weeks after the exam. However, with the new computer-based exam, you should receive your results in 7 to 10 days. And depending on your state, you will be notified of your exam results online through your MyNCEES account or via postal mail from your state licensing board. I don't know how Indiana does that. I haven't really talked to a whole lot of applicants after they've completed their test as to when they've gotten it, but anyway, obviously with the computer-based testing, things get expedited there. And the results of exams from 2020 up to July of 2020 are shown here, and what they've had. This is NCEES. Has nothing to do with the Indiana portion, Indiana specific portion. First time exam takers, there were 166 of them, and that's 75% passed. And repeat takers were 60, and of those 60, 65% of the takers passed. But if you look at this, you're looking at the first 7 months of testing, and we've only had here 166 new takers, and that's across the country. And so that gives you a good snapshot of how few individuals are out there that are seeking surveying licensure, and why we're in such a rut of needing new licensees coming through the pipeline. We always try to keep the applicants and the testees aware of the calculator policy. Obviously, with technology, calculators have changed drastically over the last several years, and so NCEES keeps a current calculator policy on their website, and it's understandable. I'm not going to read everything that's on here. It's understandable why you'd have to do that with all the programmable calculators and graphing calculators and things like that. They're testing you on your knowledge, not on your ability to work programs out. And so for 2020, you can see they have 3 different types of calculators with a couple of models each that are allowed. The following calculator models are the only ones acceptable for use during the 2020 exams. You can use Casio calculators, all FX115 and FX991 models. And any Casio calculator must have the words or model number FX115 or FX991 in its model name. As far as Hewlett-Packard, they only allow the HP33S and HP35S models, no others. Hewlett-Packard has traditionally been a pretty popular calculator for surveyors over the years, particularly with the 48s and the programmable cards you can put in there, but they do not allow for that. 33S and 35S models are the only ones. And then for Texas Instruments, any TI-30X model or TI-36X models. And again, the 30X and 36X has to be in the model number or the model name. Also want to go over some general information about the Indiana specific exam. This exam is split into 2 parts. There's a multiple choice part, which is part 1, and that's about 40 questions. They say 40 plus or minus questions. And the second part of the exam is a legal description. And the candidate must achieve a score of 70 or higher on both parts, not as an average, on both parts. It takes 2.5 hours to complete, and the exam is offered 4 times a year. As far as some study material, you would want to make sure that you go through the Indiana Administrative Code, Title 865. Title 865 is the administrative code for the profession of land surveying in Indiana, and there's various rules in there. We've already, in the modules that we went over, the titles of the modules, you heard me talk about Rule 12 and Rule 10 for ethics and whatnot, but the questions could come from any of the 3 bullets that are here from the Indiana Administrative Code, and it's almost the entire code. 865 IAC 1-1 through 11, so that's 11 different rules there that you should be familiar with, and you're going to get into a lot of different topics there. We'll talk about some of that when we go through some of the modules, but you're going to be getting into the rules of the board. You're going to be getting into things like requirements for examination and how they differ with varying degrees, and the testing processes, and a lot of different rules that need to be followed. Rule 12 I had mentioned, we're going to have a whole module on that, which is the minimum standards of practice for boundary surveys in Indiana. And then Rule 15 is on continuing education. There's not a separate module on that. That's a pretty simple rule to look at, but you should make sure you understand how many continuing education hours, CEHs is what we call them in Indiana, that an applicant has to have to renew their license for a 2-year period, the biennium period. And then additionally, we have the Indiana Code, which is the statute law, and the Indiana statutes regarding land surveyors is Indiana Code 25-21.5, and there's a lot of different laws in there that apply to surveyors, and I will have a module in here on Indiana law, and we'll be covering some of the highlighted areas there that you could expect to have questions from, but you should at least breeze through that entire code and make sure that you at least recognize what's in there. And I put this extra one on here because it's rather new. There's a new requirement for legal descriptions in Indiana, where some information on who the surveyor is and the date of the survey and surveying company and all that may need to be included in the caption of the legal description. And we're going to talk about that under the legal description module that we'll have here. That's Indiana Code 25-21.5-9-9. Again, we're pulling that out separately, and we'll make sure we look at that because that's the newest rule change from recent years. And we like to put out also a list of study material items that you could expect to have material coming from. And I'm going to go through these so that some of you, especially from out of state, may not be familiar with and why they're here. But there's some textbooks here, and there's some smaller books and some books with terms and standards and things like that. But the first book, Land Survey Systems, is written by John McIntyre. That's a book that covers the entire public land system. And John McIntyre was a professor at Purdue University back in the 70s and on when the land surveying program down there was born and was actually having its best years. And his book has been very well used in Indiana, and I in fact teach my land survey systems class based on John McIntyre's book. But it's a good book that gives a decent history of the public land system. The Evidence and Procedures for Boundary Location and Boundary Control and Legal Principle textbook should be familiar to all of you. The original author of both those books was Curtis Brown, and of late the principal authors are Walter Robillard and Donald Wilson. Evidence and Procedures is in its 6th edition as I'm speaking right now, and Boundary Control and Legal Principles is in its 7th edition. And I don't know that the questions that you would get there would be necessarily pertinent to editions, and that would be hard to really look for and be able to be accurate about. But nevertheless, I would be familiar with many of the popular legal principles and areas in those books, and you'll see that I'm going to touch on those in the modules that we're going to go over relative to the topics that would fit there. As far as legal descriptions, the book that I use in class and the book that has been touted here by the folks that put the exam together in Indiana is the Writing Legal Descriptions by Gurdon Wattles. As far as the current public land system, our current manual of instructions from the Bureau of Land Management is the 2009 manual, so questions on the test would come from that manual. You can get that book either through the Bureau of Land Management, or probably easier for you to go to the NSPS website, because they've been selling that for BLM. Along with that, there's the Restoration of Lost and Obliterated Corners and Subdivision of Sections, which is a guide for surveyors. That's an older book. It's a Bureau of Land Management publication. You could probably find that online someplace, and that's a good handbook. As far as the Indiana history portion, probably the best source of some of the older surveys in Indiana that are really important is Early Indiana Trails and Surveys. And in that module that we go through for Indiana history, I will certainly talk about this book. We used to be able to get it through the ISPLS, but I don't think they sell books anymore. But you should be able to find a copy of that book rather cheap online if you want to get that for your own reference. And the Definition of Surveying and Associated Terms is a good definitions book that had been published by American Congress on Surveying and Mapping, which is no longer an organization. That's now the NSPS has taken that over, and they've sold that manual in their bookstore. You can see that on their NSPS website, and I believe that within the last year NSPS has come out with a newer version of that definitions book, and it's is in fact published by NSPS, and it says that on the cover. So the later book would probably be the better, but it's a very handy book. I recommend all of my students get that book and keep it on their bookshelf even after they get their license. And then, as you may or may not know, there are some minor engineering areas that Indiana surveyors can get involved with if it's relative to a subdivision that they're laying out. And that would have anything to do with gravity flow sewers and with storm drainage. And so a study source for that material is what's typically termed as the 10 state standards. And the technical name for it is the Great Lakes Upper Mississippi River Board of State and Provincial Public Health and Environmental Managers, Recommended Standards for Wastewater Facilities. We're not going to get into wastewater treatment, which is the bulk of the book. It's actually available in a PDF online for you. I got a website for you there. But there's a lot of information there, and we're not going to go over much of that in the short module that we'll have for that type of information. But since you're, as a surveyor, can certify certain parts of the design based on the subdivision you lay out, we have to be tested on those areas that you should have some knowledge on. So this is a good list of resources for you to use for study purposes for this test and for practice when you have your license. And so with that concludes the introduction session of the ISPLS PS exam review.